Hello everyone, I'm Matthew Laing, UK Business Development Manager over at Cathy, and I'm joined today by Liam Murray, our Group GIS Lead, and we're going to talk to you today about improving LCOE understanding with leasing stage ground models. Slide. So a little bit of an outline about what this presentation is going to include. We're going to give a little bit of introduction on Cathy for you people here who maybe don't know us yet, and but I know a lot of you probably will. Go through myself and Liam, and then a few objectives for the day is to learn a bit about what LCOE is, what we talk about, what we mean when we're talking about ground models, what sort of data sources do we have when we're discussing ground models, and what that can really mean at the leasing stage, and have a little bit of a summary at the end there. So for people in the audience who don't know Cathy Group particularly well, I know a lot of you will, but we are a sort of offshore geoscience and engineering consultancy covering geotechnical and geophysical and geology kind of arms, and we our tagline of the company there is at the bottom of each slide as expertise seabed and below. So we get involved in a range of different offshore industries across wind, subsea cables specifically, and then also get involved in sort of marine energy, ports, oil and gas. And we are involved in sort of the full area of the project life cycle, right through from initial feasibility stage, which is what we're going to be talking a little bit more about today, right through for the full design, construction and decommissioning of the of these assets, which we're currently seeing more and more of, with especially within wind as these assets start to get to end of life. So I'm one of your speakers today. Mainly I'm splitting the role. I'm Matt Lane. I am the business development manager, and I also get involved in project management of especially cables projects, but also foundations and different stuff. Liam, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Liam Murray. I'm the GIS lead at Cathy. So I've been at Cathy for maybe 3 years, and before that spent 7 years in offshore wind development as well. So yeah, just a bit of a basic background for myself as well.
So LCOE is a term in the title there, but what actually is it for people who maybe aren't as know the acronym there? It stands for levelized cost of energy, and that is essentially a comparison between the costs spent over the lifetime of an energy asset development, with compared to the kind of sum of the electrical energy produced, i.e. what the developer will be, or the owner of the asset will be expecting to regain as cost, and it's sort of thought as a bottom line of that, and your LCOE is typically talked about in the sort of minimum costs you expect to recoup over the lifetime compared to the overall some of the costs presented, and you've got the little calculation of the simple side there. And it's used across all energy markets, wind being one of them, which we're mainly talking about offshore wind today. But it's used across all different energy markets as a sort of bottom line. It includes what you try to do with your capex in your initial development phase and engineering design phase, reducing your OPEX and how we can reduce that over the time, and then but also brings in whether we can increase production and more efficient production, and through that we try and add confidence to the design that you're going to recoup that energy costs through the lifetime of it, but also reduce any risk or the part of the project that's going in. So that's the sort of end goal of any project, I guess, and that's what we're trying to minimize as much as we can, those initial costs, by doing the sort of stuff we're doing now. Move on. One of the ways in which we try and minimize this, especially these upfront costs in the development phase and that sort of capex opex section, is to develop what we call a ground model. A ground model is a comprehensive and importantly ever-evolving spatial database which includes all the interpretation of site geology, and all the available geophysical and geotechnical data. Now, this is a built-up model of everything you can see in the sort of image there how it's got different layers to it. It's got a lot of things included, typically things such as geological units. We actually try and develop the properties of these units into it. Anywhere where these site investigations have occurred and other geophysical track lines that have happened, survey lines, targets and different things that have occurred. So if there's boulders there, different points of debris, potential UXO, or things included in the seabed that can have an impact on the development of a wind farm, and any geohazards, some shallow gas gravel fields, whether we think there's going to be instability offshore, and anything other than that, including sort of current level and wind speed and that sort of stuff can be built into it. And what we try to do in terms of these ground models at Cathie's is to create a sort of integrated approach involving all of our different aspects of our company, which has geophysicists, our geotechnical engineers, and the geospatial analysts, to bring in all that expertise to try and develop the most detailed ground model possible with all the survey information that is available at any time. And as we say, it's ever evolving, so the more survey information we get in through the lifetime of the project, right through from feasibility to the actual construction phase or beyond, it'll ever be evolving and ever expanding of the detail within it. So why is this important? And that is simply answered by saying it aids our understanding of what is out there under the sea. It's quite hard to know what is there in any detail. It's hard to get to it. We do as many surveys as we can, geophysical surveys, doing survey lines and scanning of the seabed. We do geotechnical boreholes or grab samples or different aspects of a geotechnical investigation. And it effectively allows us to bring all that together in a combination, combining that data and interpolating across the site as best we can. It gives us, as close as possible, a 3D representative model of the actual site conditions there. And as I said before, and we can apply the strength characteristics and different aspects of the variability across the site as much as we can. It can sort of become the main reference point for any of the engineering tasks we're doing in that site, be that foundation design, which requires many different aspects, including thickness of these layers and strength of these layers for possibly many meters. If you're talking about a monopile, which is can be many tens of meters long, you need kind of good strength characteristics across all that depth, and it allows us to build up those layers into a full, to an extent, a virtual model of the site. It can also highlight gaps in the current survey where the interpolation between these different older surveys isn't quite as detailed as we would hope for, and then we'll get that coverage of the site. And what we're going to talk about next is how we can use these to identify preferable or potentially less preferable areas for development, especially in the early phase. So this is what we're going to talk about a little bit today, and how we use those ground models when we actually don't have that much data. In the early development phase of any project, in the leasing stage, which is kind of going on now around the UK with the England and Wales round 4 leasing areas and the Scotland, which can be seen there. We don't have a lot of primary survey data, survey data to go out, which have went out and taken specifically for that site. And what we do have isn't very detailed, typically because these areas are quite large, impractical to survey fully, and ahead of ever putting down an auction price for you to work on that lease area, you don't want to be spending too much money in that upfront stage to get all this information on the site if you're not going to use it going forward in a longer term. So the challenge we have as engineers and analysts is to try and understand this site and what they could potentially build there, whether it's possible to build things there, and what sort of capex and opex costs they may have ahead of the site development, purely based on open source information that you can take from online and different sources that we can have ahead of a survey, sort of very early stage of the project, and how much can we build an effective ground model or something which gives us tangible, detailed information to make these decisions at this early stage. So, which Liam will talk a little bit more about the data sources possible now.
Yes. So just in terms of the data that we can use at that early stage, as Matt mentioned, that a fully formed later stage ground model will have a wealth of primary data in it, but we're not really blessed with that at this stage of development. So what we try to do is acquire as many of those data sets that are out there, either open source or relatively low cost, that we can then feed into this leasing stage ground model instead. These kind of data sets, these secondary and tertiary data sets, have historically, I mean, even going back perhaps only 4 or 5 years, been quite challenging to get hold of, mainly as a combination of maybe people's unwillingness to give away data that they've collected, combined with technology that made it quite difficult to share large data sets around. What we've found in recent years is a real change in both the opinion of people of how data should be shared and the value in it, and also in the technology that lets us share that data between ourselves. And so you found an explosion in the number of open source repositories for data of all types, but obviously marine data is the one that we're focusing on. So there's just a few examples of the repositories that we use regularly at Cathie on the right of this slide. It's by no means an exhaustive list. There are some fairly obvious ones. We've got the BGS, we've got the CHOM in France, NOAA and USGS in the US, BSH in Germany, and then there's some also that we use that probably wouldn't be as obvious for a geological ground model, but we still feed them in at this early stage. Sources such as the Crown Estate, Marine Scotland, though an RSPB, for example, they would feed in maybe a more of an environmental or a socio-economic level. But at that early stage of development, these are also key data sets to consider alongside the ground conditions themselves. And so none of this data would ever replace your primary survey data in any way. But it gives you a great insight at that early stage into what the site conditions will present or are likely to present without necessarily needing all the expense of a survey at that stage. Okay, so in terms of the kind of data examples that we would feed into this leasing stage ground model, as I've just mentioned, it's not at this stage exclusively geoscience related. So there are, of course, those data sets that go in, such as bathymetry and regional geology, type and thickness. But we will also try to feed in a whole range of other sources, so we create as complete a picture of any site or development area as we possibly can. So also in there we would have socio-economic marine industry, so other wind farms, cables, pipelines, aggregate extraction areas, met ocean. So there's an example on there, the third one along, which shows some current speed data. And then also that we have some marine shipping data in there as well on the right. So these are all data sets that are available from open source repositories. So I think the bathymetry we've got on the left there is from EMODnet, which is the European agency. It's a great repository. We use it loads ourselves, so it's certainly one that's worth having a look into, not only for geoscience, but also a range of other disciplines as well. Then we have the socio-economic impacts in the second from the left. Yeah, as I mentioned, current speeds and then the shipping as well. Some of these data sets are quite coarse resolution, so you're certainly not looking at a really precise high level of detail, but it gives you a great initial example and understanding of what the conditions and the spatial characteristics are likely to be for that area. And yes, and there's plenty more as well. So this is just a handful of our commonly used or most relevant to ground models, but there are a vast amount of different themes of data that are available for the marine industry in terms of open data at the minute. So once we've acquired these data, how do we then construct something meaningful and quantifiable out of those data sets? So in a fully developed ground model, the kind of ground models you construct at a later stage of development, once you've collected your own primary data, you will be able to construct a 3D model, and that you can maybe even represent that in a 3D scene. This level of data, because it's generally aggregated or regional, it's generally, not always, but generally impractical to go to that level of detail of constructing a 3D model. But that's not to say that there aren't useful insights that you can glean from it anyway. So the usual approach that we would take then is to construct a weighted overlay or a heat map, which is a method of consolidating and aggregating all these constraints together. You would give each of the input constraints a scoring, and then each of those individual constraints is reclassified to create a constraint surface or constraint grid for that one constraint alone. Once you have all those individual constraints, you can combine those constraints, and that gives you a total constraint grid for the whole area. And that grid can be used to tell you your relative levels of suitability for construction, for development across a larger area. And this is great for really narrowing down larger areas, which tends to be the case at this early stage. Round 4 is a good example, when you really just want to clip down a huge area, but do it in a meaningful way. So the example that we have here, we've got bathymetry, which has been reclassified based on depth and also on slope. So 2 different ways of looking at the same data. And then we've also taken some existing infrastructure on the seabed. We have pipelines and cables and applied a buffer to those. And then when we combine those together, we then get a suitability map out of that, which shows us in terms of high or low suitability for the whole area, and also with some areas that we class as hard constraints, those areas you can't develop at all, hatched out. And that then starts to become a really meaningful data set that we've produced at the other end. Okay, yeah, so I think that summarizes, I guess, in terms of the way that we would develop that ground model. And just in terms of a bit of a summary of what we've gone through, we briefly gave an overview of what levelized cost of energy is, and how it's applicable, and why it should be a core consideration when developing renewable energy offshore. We've looked at what a ground model is, and focused on the idea that a ground model shouldn't be just a standalone product. It's very much a work in progress for the whole life of the project. It will always be added to and refined and more data incorporated as more data becomes available. We've run through some data sources, so those open data repositories that you can rely on when primary data aren't available, and how they can be included into your early stage ground model. And then we've talked a little about the leasing stage ground model and how that can be constructed, and how you can convert that open source data into something far more usable for making key decisions in terms of reducing your costs and your risk. Okay, so thanks very much for your time, everyone, and we'll call it a day there.